A flight attendant harshly yells at a young autistic child on board. But just as the tension peaks, she finds out something that leaves her, and everyone around, speechless. The twist? The child's family owns the entire plane. What happens next will shock you. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The flight was smooth, and the cabin was quiet. People had settled into their seats, buckled up, and the hum of the plane was the only sound that filled the air. But one family, sitting near the middle of the plane, was already starting to feel the pressure of the long flight. Their son, a young boy named Leo, wasn't quite as comfortable as the others. Leo had autism, and the sensory overload of the plane was beginning to overwhelm him. He squirmed in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest and making soft sounds to cope with the noise and movement around him. His mother, seated beside him, gently tried to calm him down. She gave him his favorite toy and adjusted his headphones, hoping it would help. But as the minutes ticked by, Leo's anxiety grew and his behavior became more noticeable. He started making louder sounds, which attracted the attention of a few passengers nearby. It was at that moment when the flight attendant, walking down the aisle, spotted them. At first, she didn't think much of it, but when she walked closer and saw Leo's erratic movements, she frowned. Without understanding the situation fully, she stopped and crossed her arms. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "Can you please keep it down? Other passengers are trying to rest." Leo's mother looked up, startled. "He's autistic," she explained calmly, "and he's having a hard time with the noise." The flight attendant didn't seem to soften at all. She wasn't interested in an explanation. "Well, that's not my problem," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the child. "We all have to follow the rules. Can you control your child or not?" Leo's mother took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew her son didn't understand the social cues, and she also knew it was hard for him to adjust in busy, noisy places like the airplane. But the flight attendant wasn't backing down. "You can't just let him make noise like this," she added, voice rising slightly. Leo, confused by the tension and the harsh tone, started making louder noises, his hands now covering his ears. It was clear the situation was escalating, and everyone on the plane could feel it. The mother tried to reassure Leo, but the stress of the interaction was too much for him. "Please," she said quietly, "just give us a moment. He'll calm down." But the flight attendant wasn't having it. "You should have prepared better if you knew your child couldn't handle this," she said before walking away, muttering under her breath. Leo's mother could hardly believe what had just happened. She glanced around, noticing that other passengers were beginning to watch, some uncomfortable, some irritated. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Another flight attendant came over, and without a word, just stood there observing. The first flight attendant was still walking up and down the aisle, keeping an eye on Leo, who was becoming more distressed by the minute. As tensions rose, the mother glanced toward the cockpit door, hoping to speak to someone who could intervene. She knew the situation was spiraling out of control, but she also knew it wasn't her fault. The flight continued as Leo's mother tried her best to comfort him, though she could see it wasn't working. The more she spoke softly to him, the more agitated Leo became. His small hands were gripping the armrests, his eyes wide with confusion and distress. He was caught in a world too loud, too fast, and none of the soothing techniques they'd used in the past seemed to help. Meanwhile, the flight attendants kept a watchful eye, clearly annoyed by the disruption. In the back of the plane, a few passengers whispered to each other, some exchanging glances as they tried to ignore the scene unfolding. Leo's mother felt the weight of their stares and felt the sting of their judgment. Though she had done nothing wrong, she had hoped the flight would go smoothly. But now it was becoming a battle to just make it through the rest of the journey. As the minutes dragged on, Leo's behavior only worsened. His mother's attempts to calm him weren't enough, and she could see that the flight attendant who had confronted her earlier was growing more impatient. It was clear that there was no sympathy, no understanding in the way she looked at them. The mother took a deep breath and whispered a few more calming words to her son, but the flight attendant was already approaching them again, her steps quick and decisive. "You need to get control of your child now," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp. "If he can't settle down, I'll have to move you to another seat, away from the rest of the passengers." Leo's mother tried to explain again, her voice trembling, but the flight attendant wasn't listening. It was clear now. The flight attendant had made up her mind. The child's behavior was unacceptable to her, and she wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses. At that moment, Leo began to cry out loudly, his anxiety overwhelming him. His cries filled the cabin, and it seemed like everyone was watching, waiting for something to happen. The flight attendant turned on her heels and walked away, shaking her head in frustration. Leo's mother sat there, speechless, feeling both helpless and angry. She wanted to tell the attendant that she didn't need her judgment, that she was already doing everything she could to help her son. But the words didn't come. She just held Leo close, trying to comfort him in the chaos. The tension hung heavy in the air. Leo's mother wasn't the only one who noticed how the rest of the passengers had started to grow restless. Some were giving her disapproving looks, others were whispering among themselves. She wished there was a way to make the situation better, but the more she tried to control the chaos, the worse it seemed to get. She just needed the flight to end, but she had no idea that the next few minutes would change everything. As Leo's cries echoed through the cabin, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, signaling that they were approaching the halfway point of the flight. For most passengers, it was just another routine announcement, but for Leo's mother, it felt like an eternity had passed since the conflict started. She tried to rock Leo gently, but the stress of the situation was wearing her down. She could see the flight attendants whispering to each other from the front, occasionally glancing back at them. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, making her even more self-conscious. Just as she was about to try and settle Leo again, the cabin door near the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped out. He walked down the aisle toward Leo's seat, his eyes scanning the cabin as if looking for something, or someone. The flight attendants quickly noticed him and straightened up, whispering to each other. The captain walked with purpose but didn't approach the family immediately. Instead, he stopped at the front of the plane to speak with one of the senior flight attendants. Leo's mother noticed the interaction. The flight attendants looked nervous, almost as if they were waiting for something. She couldn't help but wonder what was going on. But before she could think much more about it, the captain turned and started walking toward her, his eyes now fixed on her and her son. He didn't look angry or frustrated, but there was a quiet authority in his steps. As he reached her row, he stopped and gave her a polite nod. "Ma'am, I'm the captain," he said, his tone calm and reassuring. "I understand there's been a bit of a disturbance back here." Leo's mother, still on edge, nodded slowly. "Yes, my son. He's having some difficulty with the flight. He has autism, and sometimes it's hard for him to adjust to the noise." The captain's expression softened, but he didn't seem surprised. He glanced toward the front of the plane where the flight attendants were still watching, and then turned back to Leo's mother. "I can see that you're doing your best, but it's clear that there's been some misunderstanding with our crew." He paused, taking in the situation before continuing. "I think it's time for us to clear this up." Leo's mother looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low. The captain glanced at the flight attendants again, then lowered his voice. "You may not know this, but your family is very important to this flight. In fact, this plane belongs to you." The words hung in the air for a moment, leaving Leo's mother speechless. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What?" she asked. The captain nodded, a slight smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "Your family owns this plane." For a split second, everything stopped. Leo's mother couldn't process what she was hearing. The flight attendants, who had been so rude and dismissive, seemed suddenly unsure of themselves. The captain, however, remained calm, waiting for her reaction. It was at that moment that the flight attendant who had been so harsh earlier turned and saw the interaction. Her face drained of color. and she quickly took a step back, as if she could disappear into the walls of the plane. She had no idea who she had been talking to, or how much she had just messed up. The realization hit Leo's mother like a wave, and for a moment she just sat there, staring at the captain. Her heart was racing, and she struggled to process what he had just said. "My family owns this plane?" she repeated, her voice shaky. The captain nodded again, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. This plane is part of your family's private fleet," he said. "I understand the situation now, and I'm very sorry about what's happened here." He gestured towards the flight attendants who were now standing at the front of the cabin, clearly uncomfortable. Leo's mother glanced back at the attendants, who were suddenly avoiding eye contact. The once confident flight attendant who had scolded her and Leo earlier was now visibly flustered. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now that the truth was out. Leo's mother could see the change in the air, a shift from tension to disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" Leo's mother asked, still trying to wrap her head around the words. "Why would you treat us like this if you knew who we were?" The captain's face tightened slightly, as though he had been expecting this reaction. "I can't explain her actions, but I will certainly be addressing this with the crew after the flight. No one should have treated you like that, especially under these circumstances. I want you to know that this is not the standard for how we treat our passengers, no matter who they are." Leo's mother let out a slow breath. Her anger and frustration had reached a boiling point, but now, hearing the captain's words, she felt a bit of relief. Still, the damage had been done. Leo, still distressed, was now pulling at his mother's sleeve, his anxiety only increasing in the midst of the awkward conversation. The captain noticed this and turned back to the front of the plane. "I'll make sure we give you some privacy for the rest of the flight," he added. "Please, let me know if there's anything I can do to make things easier for you and your son." Leo's mother nodded, but her mind was still swirling with what had just happened. She had been made to feel like an inconvenience, like she was the one at fault for her son's condition, and now she was hearing that they were more than just passengers. They were the owners of the plane. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. As the captain turned to leave, Leo's mother gave him a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt hollow after everything that had unfolded. The captain gave a brief nod before walking back to the cockpit, leaving the flight attendants to deal with the aftermath. But it wasn't over yet. Leo's mother could feel her frustration bubbling again. She had been put in a situation where she had to defend her son, but more than that, she had been made to feel small. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. As the captain disappeared into the cockpit, Leo's mother turned her attention back to the flight attendants. They were still standing at the front of the plane exchanging glances, but none of them dared to approach. It was clear they didn't know how to handle the situation now that the truth had come out. For a moment, Leo's mother considered confronting them, but then she looked down at her son, still visibly distressed, his small body wriggling in her arms. She knew she couldn't deal with this in front of everyone. Instead, she focused on calming Leo, her hands gently brushing his hair back as she whispered reassurances to him. Slowly, his breathing began to steady, though his eyes still looked confused and uncertain. The stress of the situation had left him exhausted, and he leaned against his mother's shoulder, finally starting to settle down. Despite the tension in the air, Leo's mother managed to take a deep breath. The captain had apologized, and while that didn't undo the damage, it was a start. She tried to push the anger and frustration out of her mind and focus on getting through the rest of the flight. But it wasn't easy. She knew that once they landed, things would have to change. She couldn't let this incident slide. There were serious issues with how the crew had handled the situation. Not long after, the senior flight attendant approached cautiously. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant, and Leo's mother didn't even look up at first. She wasn't interested in any more excuses. The flight attendant stood by her seat, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, but it took a few moments before Leo's mother finally met her gaze. "I'm sorry." the flight attendant said softly, almost nervously. I didn't know. I shouldn't have said what I did. She shifted uncomfortably. I was just trying to maintain order in the cabin, but I was wrong. Leo's mother didn't respond immediately. She could hear the apology, but it didn't feel genuine. It felt more like an attempt to smooth things over, to make everything seem fine now that they knew who she was. But for Leo's mother, the apology didn't change the fact that she and her son had been treated unfairly. She took a moment before speaking. "You were rude. You treated us like we were causing a problem when we were just trying to get through the flight like everyone else. It wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about understanding," she said, her voice steady, though her anger simmered beneath. And that's what was missing, understanding. The flight attendant looked down, clearly embarrassed, and Leo's mother could see the guilt in her eyes. "I understand now," she replied, her tone quiet. I'll make sure something like this never happens again." But Leo's mother wasn't sure that was enough. She could see that the attendant felt bad, but that wasn't going to fix what had happened. It wasn't going to make Leo's anxiety disappear or erase the hurt that had been caused. She wanted more than just an apology. She wanted real change. "We'll be talking to the airline when we land," Leo's mother said firmly. "I don't want this to happen again to anyone else. You need better training, all of you. People need to understand what it's like to travel with a child who has autism." The flight attendant nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, of course. I'm so sorry," she repeated, then turned and walked away, leaving Leo's mother to think about the rest of the flight. The rest of the journey was quiet. Leo had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, exhausted from the emotional strain. The tension between the flight attendants and the passengers seemed to lift slightly, though Leo's mother couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She'd been made to feel like an outsider, and even though the captain had apologized, the entire experience had left a bitter taste. As the plane began its descent into their destination, Leo's mother looked out the window, thinking about what would happen next. This wouldn't be the last time she'd stand up for her son, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time she'd demand respect for him and others like him. But for now, she focused on the one thing that mattered most: getting Leo off the plane and into a calm environment, away from the judgment and misunderstanding of the past few hours. The plane began its descent, and Leo's mother sat quietly, still holding her son in her lap. The lights in the cabin dimmed, and the usual hum of the aircraft intensified as they approached the airport. But despite the routine of the descent, the atmosphere in the cabin felt far from normal. There was an uncomfortable silence that hung over the passengers, as if the entire plane was collectively holding its breath. The incident earlier in the flight had caused ripples, and it was clear that not everyone had fully processed what had happened. Leo's mother glanced around. A few passengers had already turned their attention back to their books or screens, but there were others who still seemed unsettled. She could feel their eyes, though no one was daring to stare directly at her. They had witnessed what had unfolded between her and the flight attendants, and some were undoubtedly wondering what would happen next. It was hard to shake the feeling of being on display. The flight attendant who had initially approached them with the harsh tone had disappeared for most of the rest of the flight. The others kept their distance, as if unsure how to act now that the truth was out. Leo's mother was left in a state of conflicted thoughts. She knew she needed to stay calm for Leo, but inside she was angry. The whole situation had been mishandled from the start. She had expected a more professional response from the crew, especially when it came to handling passengers with special needs. The truth was, people like Leo didn't always fit into the neatly structured world of air travel. It wasn't just the flight attendants who needed to understand that. It was everyone. As the plane descended lower, Leo stirred in her arms, blinking sleepily. His face still had traces of the earlier distress, but he seemed less agitated now that the worst of the flight was behind them. His tiny hand reached up and touched her cheek, and she smiled softly, brushing his hair away from his face. The weight of the situation was heavy on her heart, but for now, Leo's calmness was enough to steady her. She could think about what to do next once they were on the ground. but the thought of speaking to the airline about this incident lingered in her mind. She had been through enough of these types of interactions to know that it wouldn't be easy. The airline would likely try to sweep it under the rug, offer some platitudes, and promise that training would be improved. But she knew better than to take that at face value. She wanted real change, something that would make a difference not just for her and Leo, but for every parent traveling with a child who had autism or any other special need. It wasn't enough to apologize. The airline needed to acknowledge their failure and put the proper measures in place to make sure no one else had to experience what she had just gone through. As the plane touched down with a soft thud, Leo's mother tightened her grip on him, holding him close as the seatbelt sign blinked on. The flight attendants had resumed their duties, preparing the cabin for landing, but there was no sign of the captain anymore. Leo's mother looked out the window, watching the ground approach. Her thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let this go. The incident had to be addressed, not just for her family, but for everyone else who might face the same judgment, the same misunderstanding in the future. Once the plane had fully landed and taxied to the gate, the usual rush of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings began. But Leo's mother stayed in her seat for a moment longer, still holding Leo, who was now half asleep, on her lap. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. She had things to do before she could walk off that plane. One of the senior flight attendants came down the aisle again, this time with a much softer expression. She paused at Leo's mother's seat, looking unsure but determined. "Ma'am," she started, her voice quiet. "I just wanted to say again how sorry we are for the way things were handled earlier. It was unacceptable, and I'll make sure to pass on the message to the airline. We don't want to treat anyone like that." Leo's mother nodded, but she didn't immediately respond. The apology felt a little hollow. She had heard it before, and it wasn't enough. Still, she appreciated the fact that the attendant seemed more sincere this time. "I appreciate your words," Leo's mother said, her voice calm but firm. "But what happened today can't be brushed aside. I'll be contacting the airline to make sure this is addressed properly." The flight attendant nodded, looking genuinely concerned. "I understand. We'll do whatever we can to help with that." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I really do hope things get better for you and your son. No one should have to go through something like this." Leo's mother gave a small, tight smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you. But it's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else feels like this. I'll be making sure the airline takes this seriously." With that, the flight attendant walked away, leaving Leo's mother alone with her thoughts. The plane had come to a full stop, and passengers were now lining up in the aisle to deplane. Leo's mother gently shook her son awake and carefully began to gather their things. It was time to get off the plane, but she knew this was far from over. Once they were off this flight, her work would begin. As she stepped into the aisle with Leo in her arms, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. This had to change. It had to, and she would make sure it did. As Leo's mother made her way down the aisle, she could still feel the weight of the entire situation pressing down on her. The flight attendants had stepped back, their faces unreadable as passengers shuffled past. There was a distinct tension in the air, a lingering discomfort that seemed to be shared by everyone, even if no one spoke about it openly. Leo, now wide awake and holding on to his mother tightly, could sense the unease around them, but he was far more focused on his own needs, his fingers playing with the fabric of her jacket, his eyes darting from face to face, trying to make sense of the world around him. As they reached the door and prepared to step off the plane, Leo's mother took one last look around. She could see the flight attendants talking in low voices, avoiding her gaze. But she didn't care. The apology earlier had been too little, too late. It wasn't just about a few harsh words. It was about a system that didn't understand, didn't accommodate, and more than anything, didn't care. Once they were in the terminal, Leo's mother moved quickly, her feet carrying her toward the exit. She needed to get out of the crowded space, away from the noise and the bright lights. She was done being watched, done being judged. But at the same time, she knew that the real challenge was just beginning. She couldn't walk away from this without making sure that something changed. She had seen firsthand how a lack of understanding could affect families like hers. This wasn't just about her son. It was about everyone who didn't fit into the mold of the perfect traveler. They reached the baggage claim area, and Leo's mother paused for a moment, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Leo tugged at her sleeve, clearly wanting attention, so she bent down and gave him a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," she whispered to him, brushing the hair from his face. Leo's small hand rested in hers, his fingers wrapping around her fingers like a lifeline. They were almost out of this mess. But the weight of the incident continued to hang over her. It wasn't just the flight attendant's treatment, though that was bad enough. It was the whole way things had unfolded. The lack of patience, the lack of understanding, the assumption that people could simply behave their way through situations like this. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about a broader culture, one where people with disabilities, particularly autism, were often overlooked or treated as if their needs were an inconvenience, and that wasn't something she was going to let slide. As they waited for their luggage, Leo's mother pulled out her phone and began to compose an email. She knew she had to start documenting everything, getting the details down while they were still fresh. The airline needed to understand what had happened, not just the way their staff had handled the situation, but the lasting impact it had on her son. It was one thing for people to say, "I'm sorry," but it was another thing entirely to make sure that those apologies led to real change. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, typing out a concise but firm message. She explained the entire ordeal, from Leo's sensory overload to the way the flight attendants had treated them. She made sure to mention that, even though the family owned the plane, it wasn't about the money or status. It was about respect and the dignity of all passengers. This wasn't something that should have been swept under the rug, and she wasn't going to let that happen. Once she finished the email, she hit send and sat back, her eyes still focused on the screen. She knew the email alone wouldn't change anything. She'd need to follow up, press harder, and make sure her voice was heard. But sending it felt like the first step toward doing something that mattered. Leo's mother sighed deeply, feeling both exhausted and empowered. She had fought to keep her son calm through the entire ordeal, and she had fought to stay composed when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. Now that the flight was over, she felt like she could finally breathe again, but it was a short-lived relief. She knew this would be an ongoing battle. The carousel finally started to turn, and their bags appeared. Leo's mother grabbed their luggage, keeping her son close as they headed toward the exit. The airport was still noisy, still bustling with people rushing from gate to gate. But for her, the chaos of the terminal felt distant, like it belonged to another world. She was still stuck in the aftermath of that flight, still haunted by the way she had been made to feel. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them. Leo's mother inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. It wasn't much, but it was a small relief. She knew the work ahead of her wasn't going to be easy. She had already planned what she would do next. Contact the airline's customer service, follow up with the complaint, escalate it if she had to. She wouldn't let this go, not when her son had been treated like that. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about one flight attendant, or one misunderstanding. It was about a deeper problem. It was about the way society often overlooked the needs of people with autism. The misunderstanding wasn't just in the sky. It was in everyday life. It was in classrooms, at grocery stores, and yes, even on airplanes. Leo's mother held his hand as they walked toward their car. "We're going to fix this, Leo," she whispered softly, though he couldn't quite understand what she meant. This is only the beginning. And in that moment, as they stepped away from the airport and into the world beyond, she knew she had to see this through. Because if no one else would fight for the respect and dignity of children like Leo, she would. As Leo's mother drove home, the weight of everything still sat heavily on her chest. The quiet hum of the car engine was a stark contrast to the chaos of the flight, but it didn't bring the peace she was hoping for. The airport had been a small reprieve, a brief moment of escape, but the emotional toll of the entire situation was far from over. Every few seconds her mind would flash back to the flight, to the way the attendants had looked at her and Leo, like they were the problem, like they were the ones who didn't belong. She had kept her composure for as long as she could, but now that the physical stress of the flight was behind her, the emotional weight was settling in. She glanced at Leo in the rearview mirror. He was quietly staring out the window, lost in his own world, his small fingers still grasping the toy he'd held tightly throughout the flight. His face was calm now, no longer showing the anxiety he'd had earlier, but his mother could tell that the events of the day had left their mark on him. He didn't understand what had happened, but he understood when things felt wrong, when the atmosphere was tense, and that, in itself, hurt her more than anything else. She wanted to protect him from the world, from the misunderstandings, from the people who couldn't see past his behavior. But it wasn't always possible. In fact, more often than not, she found herself having to explain things, having to stand up for him, to make sure he was treated fairly. And today, for the first time, she had been forced to defend him in front of an entire flight crew, in front of dozens of passengers. The thought made her blood boil, even as she tried to maintain her composure behind the wheel. She knew the airline needed to hear her voice, and she would make sure of it. But what came next? What kind of impact would her complaint have? Would they truly listen? Or would they brush her off, like so many others had done in the past? The idea of fighting the system was daunting, but she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just about her son. It was about making sure that every child, every adult, every person who had ever been overlooked or judged unfairly for something beyond their control had a voice. She wasn't the first person to face this kind of treatment, and she wouldn't be the last. But she could make a difference. She had to. By the time they reached home, the streets were starting to quiet down. The rush of the day was over and the evening had settled in. Leo had already drifted off to sleep in his car seat, his head resting against the window, his soft breathing the only sound filling the space. His mother turned off the engine, the silence of the car offering a moment of reflection. She sat there for a while, staring at the empty road in front of her, letting her thoughts swirl. Tomorrow, she would follow up with the airline. She would reach out to customer service, escalate the issue if necessary, and make sure that the crew was held accountable. But more than that, she needed to ask herself a hard question. What was she really hoping to achieve by all of this? Was it just an apology she wanted? Or was it something deeper, something that would affect real change? It wasn't just about an apology for Leo. It was about shifting the mindset, about making sure that airlines and other industries understood that children with autism, or anyone with a disability, weren't a nuisance to be dealt with, or an inconvenience to be dismissed. They were people with their own unique needs, and they deserved to be treated with respect. With a deep breath, she unclipped her seatbelt and carefully lifted Leo from his car seat. He stirred but didn't wake. She carried him inside, his tiny body light in her arms, and gently placed him in his bed. She watched him for a moment, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, before turning off the light and closing the door behind her. For a few minutes, she sat in the quiet of the house, the weight of the day finally beginning to settle into a more manageable place. She knew there would be more battles to fight, more difficult conversations to have. But as she reached for her phone again to check her email and draft a follow-up message to the airline, she realized something important. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were countless other parents, countless other families who had faced the same frustrations, the same unfair treatment. She wasn't just advocating for Leo anymore, she was advocating for all of them. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she began to type. I am writing to follow up on my complaint from earlier today. I want to make sure that this incident is not just swept under the rug, and that real action is taken to ensure that no other family has to go through what we experienced. My son, like many children with autism, needs to be treated with understanding, not scorn. I want to know what steps will be taken to train your staff to handle such situations more effectively, and how we can make sure this doesn't happen again. She hit send, but her mind was already racing ahead to what needed to come next. This was only the beginning. She couldn't let up now, not when she knew that real change was possible. The airlines, and society in general, needed to understand that autism wasn't something to be tolerated. It was something to be understood, respected, and accommodated. As she set the phone down, a new sense of determination washed over her. She would keep pushing. She would make sure that her son, and children like him, never had to endure such ignorance again. And if that meant taking on an entire industry, she was ready. Tomorrow she would call again. Tomorrow she would make sure the airline knew exactly how serious she was. And tomorrow she would make sure that Leo's voice, his story, was heard, no matter how much resistance she met along the way. The following morning, Leo's mother woke up early. The house was quiet, the soft morning light streaming through the blinds as she sat on the edge of her bed, trying to gather her thoughts. She had barely slept the night before, her mind constantly replaying the events of the flight, wondering if she had done enough, if she could have handled it better, if there was more she could have said to the flight attendants, or even the captain. But she knew she couldn't change what had already happened. What mattered now was what came next. How she would turn this frustrating, upsetting experience into something meaningful, something that would spark real change. She glanced over at Leo, who was still fast asleep in his room. She could hear the soft murmur of his breathing through the walls, and for a moment, a wave of gratitude washed over her. He was safe, he was home, and he was okay. But the reality of the situation was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened on that flight wasn't just a random incident. It was a reflection of a deeper, more pervasive problem. The lack of understanding, the assumptions people made about autism, the way children with special needs were often treated as burdens rather than understood as individuals with unique challenges. It was a problem that extended far beyond just one flight, one crew, or one airline. It was a societal issue, and she knew it had to change. After a few moments of quiet reflection, she stood up and moved toward the kitchen, preparing a cup of coffee. Her hands moved automatically, the routine grounding her as she allowed herself a brief moment of calm before the storm of phone calls and emails. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she took out her phone, opened her email, and reread the message she had sent to the airline last night. It was firm, clear, and to the point. But now that some time had passed, she wanted to make sure it wasn't just a complaint. It had to be a call for action. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, thinking about how she would phrase the follow-up message. She wanted to make sure the airline understood that this wasn't just about an isolated incident. It was about a lack of training, a lack of awareness, and a lack of compassion. It was about creating an environment where people, no matter their challenges, felt respected and supported. "Dear customer service," she began, typing slowly but deliberately. "I'm following up regarding the incident I reported yesterday, involving my son, who has autism, and the treatment we received during our flight. While I appreciate the apology I received from the captain and the senior flight attendant, it's clear that the issue goes far beyond a single interaction. What happened to us is part of a larger pattern of misunderstanding that I see far too often in society, and it's something that airlines like yours can help address." She paused for a moment, reflecting on her words. She wasn't angry, not anymore, but she was determined. This wasn't about demanding retribution. It was about asking for a commitment to change. She wanted the airline to take a hard look at how they trained their staff, how they dealt with passengers with special needs, and how they could improve in the future. "I would like to know what steps will be taken to ensure that your flight attendants, pilots, and other staff are properly educated on autism and other conditions that may require special accommodations," she continued. "I understand that it's not always easy to know how to handle such situations, but there is no excuse for making a passenger feel less than or unwelcome. I am asking for a concrete plan, a clear outline of how your airline will address this issue going forward." As she typed, her thoughts became clearer. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her child's dignity. She was speaking for a broader group of people, She was speaking for every parent who had ever had to explain their child's behavior to a stranger. For every person with autism who had ever been treated like they were a problem to be solved, rather than an individual to be understood. And finally, she added, I would like a direct response from someone in leadership at your airline, someone who can explain how you plan to address this issue on a broader scale. This isn't just about one flight. It's about creating an environment where all passengers are treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of their disabilities. She reread the email and then hit send. Her heart was pounding a little faster now. It wasn't just about sending an email, it was about taking a stand. She knew that sending the email alone wouldn't be enough. But it was a start, and she was ready for whatever came next. After finishing her coffee, she picked up the phone and dialed the airline's customer service number. She had already made her complaint through email. But she knew the next step was to get someone on the phone. Someone who could actually do something about it. The phone rang for a few moments before someone picked up, and the familiar sound of an automated voice greeted her. She selected the option to speak to a representative and was placed on hold. The minutes ticked by, but she didn't mind. She was ready to fight for change, no matter how long it took. When the representative finally came on the line, Leo's mother quickly explained who she was and the incident she was referring to. She kept her voice steady, but there was an urgency in it. I've already sent an email about an incident on my flight yesterday. I was hoping to speak with someone who can give me more information on how the airline plans to address this issue, she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. The representative took a few moments to review her information and then asked, What exactly would you like to see happen, ma'am? Leo's mother paused for a moment thinking. She could have asked for a simple apology or for a small gesture to make up for the way she and her son had been treated. But that wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She wanted change. Real change. I want a clear plan. I want this airline to commit to better training for its staff, on autism awareness, on how to approach situations like mine with compassion and understanding. I want to know that my family and families like mine will be treated with the respect we deserve when we travel. And I want to know how you plan to make sure this doesn't happen again. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the representative responded. I understand your concerns, ma'am, and I will make sure to pass them along to the appropriate team. It's important to us that we provide the best possible service to all of our customers. I appreciate that, Leo's mother replied, her voice still steady. But I need more than just words. I need to know that something is being done, and I expect to hear back from you soon with a concrete plan. The representative assured her that she would receive a follow-up in the coming days, and they ended the call. Leo's mother hung up, her heart still racing. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the flight, she felt a sense of control. She was doing something about it. She was making sure that this wasn't just another incident that would be forgotten. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction, and she was ready for the next one. The days that followed felt like a blur. Leo's mother had already set her mind to pushing forward with her complaint, but the reality of what that would involve began to sink in. The more she thought about it, the more layers of this issue she uncovered. It wasn't just the flight attendants who were responsible for what had happened. It was the entire framework around how people with autism were treated, especially in public spaces like airports and airplanes. But she wasn't going to let herself get overwhelmed. This wasn't the first battle she'd fought for Leo's well-being, and it wouldn't be the last. She spent the next couple of days gathering her thoughts, collecting stories from other parents she knew who had similar experiences. She reached out to support groups online, asking if anyone had faced discrimination or ignorance while traveling with children on the spectrum. It didn't take long before her inbox started filling up with responses. Some were heartbreaking. Stories of parents being thrown off flights, of families being forced to deal with overzealous security personnel, or flight crews that didn't bother to learn about autism before judging a child's behavior. Others were more hopeful. Stories of airline staff who had been compassionate, who had taken the time to understand and accommodate. Each response was a piece of a bigger picture. a larger movement that Leo's mother was now a part of. She realized that this wasn't just her personal fight anymore. It was a fight for every family who had been misunderstood, for every person who had ever been seen as a problem, because they didn't fit into the standard mold of normal behavior. By the end of the week, Leo's mother had compiled a report. It wasn't just a letter to the airline anymore. It was a call to action, a demand for change that she could send not only to the airline but also to autism advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, and even government officials. She wasn't looking for handouts. She wasn't asking for sympathy. What she was asking for was respect and for better treatment for people with autism, especially in situations like air travel, where the stress of the environment can exacerbate symptoms and behaviors. She knew this wouldn't be easy. She had already braced herself for the possibility of the airline pushing back, but this time, she had prepared herself for any response, positive or negative. She had decided that no matter how long it took, no matter how many hoops she had to jump through, she would make sure this issue didn't get swept under the rug. One afternoon, after having lunch with a friend who had shared a similar experience with her child on a flight, Leo's mother received the follow-up email she had been waiting for from the airline. She quickly opened it, her heart beating a little faster. The email was from a customer relations representative, and it started with an apology. "Dear Mrs. Cooper," the email began, "thank you for reaching out to us and for your patience as we reviewed your complaint. We want to begin by expressing our deepest apologies for the way you and your son were treated on your recent flight. We take your concerns seriously, and we appreciate you bringing this matter to our attention." At first glance, it seemed like the usual company apology, the kind that was polite and professional but often felt empty. Leo's mother braced herself, expecting to read more of the same hollow words she had seen in past complaints, vague promises of better service and customer care. But this time, there was more. "As a result of your feedback, we have initiated a review of our training materials and are in the process of implementing a more comprehensive program for all of our staff. This new training will focus on increasing awareness of autism spectrum disorder, as well as other disabilities that require specific accommodations. We are also incorporating new protocols for handling sensitive situations with empathy and understanding." For a moment, Leo's mother felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was what she had been asking for, an acknowledgement that the training needed to change, that staff needed to be educated on how to approach passengers with autism and other special needs. But she couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She kept reading. "We understand that actions speak louder than words, and we are committed to taking the necessary steps to improve our service. As part of this initiative, we will be offering all of our flight crews additional resources on autism awareness and disability sensitivity. Additionally, we are introducing a new protocol that will allow passengers with special needs, like your son, to receive priority assistance if needed. We want to ensure that every passenger feels safe and respected while flying with us." The words were exactly what she had hoped to hear, but they were still just words. She needed to know what this would look like in practice. What would the training entail? How would the airline measure its success? How would they ensure that staff didn't just go through the motions but actually understood the issues they were addressing? The email ended with a promise to reach out to her again soon for further follow-up, and a brief offer of a travel voucher as a gesture of goodwill. Leo's mother sat back staring at the screen. The first part of her mission had been accomplished. They had acknowledged the issue, committed to a review of their training, and promised to do better. But she knew this couldn't be the end. She had been here before. Companies had made promises, sent apologies, but nothing ever truly changed. She couldn't afford to let them think that this was enough. Without hesitation, she started drafting her response. It was a polite but firm letter that thanked them for their commitment, but asked for more details. She requested specific timelines for the new training programs, asked for transparency on how the airline would monitor staff compliance, and even suggested that the airline work with autism advocacy groups to create a framework for understanding disabilities in air travel. She knew that if she didn't keep the pressure on, it would be too easy for them to let this fade away into good intentions that didn't amount to anything. As she hit send, Leo came into the room, tugging at her sleeve, ready for his usual afternoon snack. His face lit up when he saw her, his small hands holding onto the toy he'd taken from the flight. Leo's mother smiled and pulled him onto her lap, feeling the weight of the day lift just a little. She was making progress, but she knew there was still so much more to do. There were meetings to be had, policies to push for, and awareness to raise. But for the first time in a while, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. Leo's world might be full of challenges, but it was also full of potential. And now, more than ever, she felt ready to fight for that potential. To make sure that one day Leo could travel the world without having to face the ignorance and misunderstanding that had greeted them on that flight. She wasn't just doing this for him. She was doing it for all the children like him, and that was worth every ounce of effort. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and follow-ups. Leo's mother threw herself into the task at hand with a determination that surprised even her. Each morning, she woke up early to check for any updates from the airline, scanning her inbox with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had received an initial acknowledgement from customer service, a polite email assuring her that her concerns were being taken seriously, and that action was being taken behind the scenes. But promises on paper didn't always translate into real change. She wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. She made regular calls to the airline, speaking to anyone who could give her more information. Each time she asked the same questions. When would the new training be rolled out? What specific resources would be included? Would this training be mandatory for all staff, from ground crew to flight attendants? And, perhaps most importantly, how would they ensure that their staff was not just aware of autism and other special needs, but capable of handling those situations with real empathy? The answers were often vague, but over time, she started to see a shift in how the airline was responding. They didn't just offer apologies anymore. They began to give concrete timelines. Within 2 weeks, they assured her, they would be implementing a pilot program for autism awareness training for all flight attendants. After that, they would be expanding it to other parts of the airline's operation, including customer service representatives and gate agents. But despite these steps forward, Leo's mother knew this was just the beginning. A few changes to training programs didn't guarantee that the culture of the airline would shift, or that every employee would embrace those changes. What she needed now was to ensure that the airline was genuinely invested in understanding the needs of passengers with autism, and that meant holding them accountable. She started looking beyond just the airline itself. If this was going to be a systemic change, it needed to be a broader conversation. Leo's mother began reaching out to autism advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, and even lawmakers who had worked on issues related to accessibility and public accommodations. She learned about initiatives in other industries aimed at increasing awareness of autism, and she found out that some airlines had already begun similar programs. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she started drafting proposals for the airline to collaborate with experts in the field, as well as advocacy organizations that could help shape the training curriculum. She didn't want them to just teach their staff the basics. She wanted them to have a deep, nuanced understanding of how autism affected behavior and what accommodations could be made to make travel easier for families like hers. As her research deepened, Leo's mother began to realize just how much work there was to do. This wasn't just about one airline. It wasn't even just about air travel. It was about accessibility on a much larger scale. How society as a whole still struggled to make accommodations for people with disabilities, especially invisible ones like autism. It was about changing perceptions, breaking down misconceptions, and demanding that individuals with autism be treated with dignity and respect wherever they went. One afternoon, after a long call with a representative from an autism advocacy group, Leo's mother felt a shift in herself. She wasn't just reacting to the incident on the plane anymore. She was now actively involved in a movement to change how the world treated her son and children like him. For years, she had tried to make the world a safer, more understanding place for Leo, but now, she was realizing that change could be bigger than just her family. Leo's mother started drafting a comprehensive proposal, one that not only addressed training for airline staff, but also offered suggestions for policy changes at the governmental level. She wanted airlines, public transportation systems, and even theme parks to adopt standards for interacting with individuals with autism. There were already laws requiring accommodations for people with physical disabilities. But what about those with developmental disabilities? The law was behind in many ways, and she knew that the only way to close the gap was through persistent advocacy and collaboration with the right people. She spent hours writing, calling, and meeting with experts. It was exhausting work, but it felt important, like a mission. She began to realize that by taking this on, she was not just advocating for Leo's needs. She was advocating for an entire community of families and individuals who had long been overlooked. In the process, she began to feel like she was part of something bigger than herself, a movement that wasn't just about changing one company's policy, but about changing the way society approached autism and disability in general. But there were moments of doubt too. Even as the airline assured her they were moving forward with their training program, Leo's mother couldn't help but wonder if this was really enough. Was this the change she had been hoping for, or was it just a band-aid on a much deeper issue? She had learned over the years that promises from large organizations often didn't result in the kind of systemic change that was needed. She couldn't afford to stop pushing, to let the momentum she had built slip away. So she pressed on. She began working with a coalition of disability advocates to propose a new set of guidelines for the airline industry, one that would specifically address autism awareness and provide a framework for training staff. The guidelines weren't just about teaching employees how to deal with passengers who had autism. They were about fostering a culture of respect and understanding. It was about creating an environment where staff were equipped to help, where families felt supported, not judged. Then, a few weeks after sending her follow-up email, Leo's mother received a call from a senior executive at the airline. It wasn't someone she had spoken to before, but the tone in their voice immediately told her this wasn't just another customer service representative. The executive introduced themselves as part of a special committee created to address customer feedback on autism and accessibility. The call, as it turned out, was a direct result of her persistence. "We've been reviewing your suggestions, and we'd like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss how we can work together on some of the larger initiatives you've outlined," the executive said. "We think this could be a great opportunity to make a real, lasting impact, not just within our airline but within the industry as a whole." For a moment, Leo's mother was speechless. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to push past the bureaucracy, the walls of corporate indifference, and now, finally, it seemed like someone was actually listening. "I'd be happy to meet," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this. Let's make sure we get this right." As they set a date for the meeting, Leo's mother felt a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't done yet, far from it, but this was a significant step forward. She could feel the weight of the past few weeks finally starting to lift. For the first time, she felt like she was not only fighting for Leo, but for all the children who deserved better, all the families who had to face the world's indifference every day. Her work wasn't finished, but she was no longer fighting alone. The momentum was building, and with each step, the vision of a more inclusive world for her son, and for so many others, was becoming clearer. This was the kind of change that could echo across industries, across countries, and across generations. And for the first time, it felt like it was actually within reach. The meeting with the senior executive from the airline finally took place a week later. Leo's mother had prepared for it as if it were a high-stakes negotiation. She had gathered everything: data from advocacy groups, feedback from other families, detailed suggestions on how airlines could improve their training, and even some studies that showed how companies could benefit from better understanding autism and other disabilities. She knew that the more prepared she was, the harder it would be for them to dismiss her concerns. This wasn't just about making noise anymore. It was about crafting a solution that could actually work, something tangible that could help shift the way airlines thought about passengers with special needs. As she walked into the hotel conference room where the meeting was being held, Leo's mother could feel the weight of the moment. She was no longer just a concerned parent. She had become an advocate, a voice for countless others who had faced discrimination and misunderstanding. The room was sleek with glass walls and polished wooden floors, but the business-like atmosphere didn't intimidate her. She had worked too hard for too long to let that happen now. The executive, a man named Adam, greeted her warmly as she entered. "Thank you for meeting with me today," he said, his voice polite but warm. "We've been reviewing everything you've sent us, and I'm really impressed with how thorough you've been. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." Leo's mother nodded, offering a smile but keeping her focus sharp. "Thank you. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, about how we can make things better, not just for my son, but for everyone who's been in the same position." As they sat down, Adam began by acknowledging the airline's commitment to improving accessibility for all passengers. He spoke about the pilot program for autism training that was already underway, explaining that a number of flight attendants had been sent to specialized workshops on autism awareness and sensitivity. Leo's mother listened carefully, but she wasn't satisfied yet. She had been promised these changes before, and though she appreciated the effort, she needed to hear more. "You've made a good start," she said. "But what I'm asking for is more than just basic awareness. What we need is comprehensive, ongoing training. Something that really changes the way your staff sees passengers like my son. It's not enough to simply acknowledge autism. Your staff needs to know how to respond when a child is overwhelmed, when a passenger's behavior is misinterpreted, or when someone needs extra support." Adam listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. "I agree," he said. "We've realized that this is more than just about awareness. It's about creating a culture of understanding, and that's something we've only begun to address. We've been working on expanding the program, and we're looking at integrating more specialized training into our regular curriculum. I'll be honest, we're just beginning to understand the depth of what needs to be done." Leo's mother pressed on. "It's great that you're working on expanding the program, but what's your timeline? How soon can you roll out this new level of training for all of your staff? And how will you measure success? It's easy to talk about culture shifts, but those don't happen overnight." Adam paused, clearly thinking carefully about her question. "You're right," he said. "It's not going to happen overnight, but we've already started integrating some of the training into our regular crew meetings, and we plan to roll out a more structured program over the next 3 to 6 months. We'll be working with autism experts and advocacy groups to make sure we're doing it right. As for measuring success, we're looking at customer feedback, employee surveys, and we're open to suggestions on how we can track progress." Leo's mother felt a flicker of hope, but she still wasn't entirely satisfied. "I appreciate that," she said. "But feedback after the fact isn't enough. I want to see more proactive steps, like a designated point of contact for passengers with autism, a way for families to let your staff know about their child's needs before boarding. The system has to be more flexible. Your staff should know in advance if a passenger needs extra time, extra space, or a quieter environment. I don't want families to feel like they have to explain everything on the spot when the flight attendants are already overwhelmed." Adam nodded again. "I see what you're saying, and I think that's a great idea. We've been considering a system where passengers could opt in for specific accommodations when booking, so that information could be passed along to the crew in advance. It's something we could easily integrate into our booking system. I think it would make a real difference in helping staff respond appropriately." Leo's mother felt a sense of progress. She wasn't getting everything she wanted, but she was hearing real solutions. That would be a good start. But we also need your staff to understand that autism isn't one size fits all. Each person is different, and behaviors can vary widely. Training shouldn't be just about how to deal with a child who's having a meltdown. It needs to focus on how to recognize when a passenger is anxious, when they're struggling, or when they're overstimulated. It's about knowing when to step in and when to give someone space. Adam leaned forward slightly, his voice earnest. I hear you, and I agree. I think part of what's been missing is that understanding. It's not just about what the symptoms are, but about recognizing the signs early, before they become an issue. That's something we're working on. He paused, then added, I'd also like to extend an offer. Once we've finalized the new program, we'd love for you to come in and meet with our training team, maybe even help us with some of the curriculum. I know it would mean a lot to the staff to hear directly from someone with experience. Leo's mother was taken aback by the offer. It wasn't what she had expected, but it was exactly the kind of collaboration she had hoped for. I'd be honored, she said. I think it could make a huge difference if we work together. As the meeting progressed, Leo's mother and Adam discussed further ways to ensure that the airline's efforts would go beyond just policy changes and training programs. They talked about developing partnerships with autism organizations, creating resources for parents traveling with special needs children, and implementing a calm zone system at airports. Quiet spaces where families could go if their child was feeling overwhelmed. By the end of the meeting, Leo's mother felt a sense of cautious optimism. There was still a lot of work to be done, but the conversation had shifted from apologies to action. The airline was starting to take her suggestions seriously, and for the first time, she felt like they were genuinely committed to making a lasting change. As she left the meeting, she felt a new kind of energy stirring inside her. She wasn't just advocating for one child, she was advocating for an entire community. She knew it would take time, but today had been a significant step forward. She had helped create a dialogue that could transform the way airlines treated passengers with autism, and she wasn't about to stop now. The fight was far from over, but now, Leo's mother felt like she was no longer alone in the fight. This was bigger than her family. It was a movement that could reach across the country, across industries, and change how people with autism were seen and treated. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful that they were finally moving in the right direction. The months that followed were a blur of emails, meetings, and constant follow-up. Leo's mother had gone from being a concerned parent to an integral part of the airline's autism awareness program. The collaboration wasn't always smooth, but it was progress, and that kept her moving forward. The airline had rolled out the first phase of the new training, and she had been invited to meet with the flight attendants and ground crew in person to talk about her experiences and offer insights into how autism affects behavior and travel. It wasn't a perfect system yet, but it was a start. As the pilot program began to take shape, she started hearing positive feedback. Staff were more mindful, more patient. They were beginning to understand how to approach situations without judgment, how to offer help without assuming a passenger's needs. There were still moments of miscommunication, but each time the airline responded quickly, using those moments as opportunities to improve. Leo's mother had also reached out to other airlines, sharing her experience and offering to help them create similar programs. She had become a sought-after speaker at autism conferences, talking about the importance of disability awareness in public spaces, especially in air travel. Her story was no longer just about a single incident. It had become part of a larger movement to create more inclusive, compassionate spaces for families like hers. But despite the progress, there was always more to do. Leo's mother knew that. She had seen the difference her efforts had made, but she also knew that not every airline or public service had adopted the same changes. And not every family had the resources or platform to push for change the way she had. Still, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction when she saw the results of her hard work. One day, several months after the initial meeting with the airline, Leo's mother received a call from the same executive, Adam. He sounded excited, which piqued her interest. "I have something to share with you," Adam said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "We've just finished our first round of employee feedback on the Autism Awareness Training Program. We've received overwhelmingly positive responses from our staff, flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, everyone. They say they feel more equipped, more confident in their ability to serve families with special needs. It's making a real difference in how they interact with passengers. And more importantly, we've received positive feedback from the families themselves. We've had families reach out to tell us how much the program has meant to them. Leo's mother felt her heart swell. This wasn't just another empty promise or corporate speak. It was tangible, measurable change. Real progress was being made, and it was happening because of the effort she had put in. She had pushed through the frustration, the late nights, the doubts, and now things were different. "That's incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad to hear that. I knew this was going to make a difference, but to hear it from the people who are actually on the front lines, that's what really matters." Adam continued, "We've also had some staff come forward with ideas for further improvement. We're even looking into adding more sensory accommodations in airports, quiet spaces for children to decompress before their flights, and some special seating arrangements for families that need more room." Leo's mother smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through her. It wasn't just the airline that had changed. It was the whole culture surrounding air travel for families like hers. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that was enough for now. "You know," Adam said, "we'd really like to honor your contribution to this initiative. We want to make sure that this change isn't just an isolated effort within our airline, but something that's seen as part of a larger movement across the industry. We've been thinking about creating an award for families or individuals who have made a lasting impact on the accessibility and inclusivity of air travel. And, if you're open to it, we'd love for you to be the first recipient." Leo's mother was taken aback by the offer. An award wasn't something she had ever considered. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for her son, for every other family that had faced the same struggles. But hearing Adam's words made her realize something important. This fight hadn't just been about one airline or one flight. It had been about changing the way society understood autism, about ensuring that the world, in every corner, could be a little bit more accommodating. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little shaky. "But I'm not doing this for any award. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I want to see change. Real, lasting change. For my son, for families like ours, for everyone." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then Adam replied, "I know. And that's exactly why we want to honor you, because you've made change happen." After they ended the call, Leo's mother sat there for a while, reflecting on the long path that had brought her here. She thought about the early days, when she had felt so alone, when she had been fighting a battle that felt insurmountable. She thought about the moments when it seemed like nothing was changing, and all she had were words of hope from people who didn't fully understand her struggle. But now, as she looked back, she saw how much had shifted, not just in the airline industry, but in the way she saw herself. She had made a difference, and in that moment she realized that the work wasn't over. She'd made huge strides, yes, but she was just one person. She was a small part of a much larger movement. A movement that was pushing for a world where understanding, inclusion, and compassion weren't the exceptions. They were the rule. As she walked into the living room, where Leo was playing with his toys, she felt a quiet pride. He looked up at her and smiled, his innocent eyes lighting up as he reached out for her. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with joy. "Can we go fly on a plane soon?" Leo's mother knelt down to his level and smiled, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had started all of this. "Yes, sweetie," she replied softly. "Yes, we can." And for the first time in a long while, she knew that the world was starting to change. One flight, one conversation, and one small victory at a time. If you found this story interesting, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.